The chapel doors swung open on a morning thick with whispered judgment, and every eye in that small Virginia church turned to stare at the bride in navy blue wool. She wore no veil, no lace, no pearls, only the carefully tailored remains of a United States Navy uniform, its brass buttons catching the pale November light like small acts of defiance. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a test of how much shame a woman could endure before breaking. Margaret Hayes stood at the threshold, her 7-year-old daughter clutching her hand, both of them trembling beneath the weight of 200 disapproving gazes. The dress she wore had belonged to her late husband, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, who'd gone down with his ship in the Pacific 2 years earlier. She'd spent 3 nights at her kitchen table, unpicking seams by candlelight, reshaping the jacket into something that might pass for bridal if you squinted and chose kindness over cruelty. The guests did not choose kindness. "Good Lord," someone muttered from the third pew, loud enough to carry. "Has she no shame?" Margaret's fingers tightened around her daughter's small hand. Little Grace looked up at her mother with wide, frightened eyes. Her Sunday dress, the only nice thing they owned, already wrinkled from anxious fidgeting. "Mama," Grace whispered, "they're staring." "I know, sweetheart. Keep walking." But Margaret's feet had turned to lead. She could see Thomas waiting at the altar, his face pale but resolute, a good man who'd proposed not out of passion, but out of pity and practicality. A widow with a child needed a husband. A widower with a farm needed help. It was the arithmetic of survival in 1944, when the war had carved holes in every family and community. Still, she'd hoped for something better than this gauntlet of contempt. Before we go further, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. And if this story pulls you in, hit that like button and subscribe. These forgotten moments deserve to be remembered. The organist struck a hesitant chord, and Margaret forced herself forward. Each step echoed against the wooden floor. Grace walked beside her, small and brave. Her role as makeshift flower girl performed without pedals because they couldn't afford even that small luxury. "Disgraceful," another voice hissed. "Wearing a dead man's uniform like it's a costume." Margaret's vision blurred. Not from tears, she'd promised herself she wouldn't cry, but from the sheer effort of remaining upright. The uniform had taken her 3 months of saved ration coupons to have the buttons polished. She'd sewn the skirt from the trouser legs, fashioned the bodice from the jacket, lined it all with fabric from her own wedding dress to Robert, the one she'd worn in 1937 when the world still made sense. She'd thought it would honor him. She'd thought people would understand. She'd been wrong. Thomas stepped forward as she reached the altar, his work-roughened hand extending toward hers. He was 52, weathered and kind in his way, and in his eyes she saw the same resignation she felt. This wasn't a love story. It was a life raft. The preacher cleared his throat, opened his Bible, and began the familiar words. Margaret barely heard them. She was too aware of the whispers behind her, the way Grace had started to cry silently, the way her own heart hammered against the wool that still smelled faintly of salt water and her husband's aftershave. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." The chapel doors banged open. Everyone turned. The preacher stopped mid-sentence. Margaret's breath caught. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the November sun. He wore a dress uniform so laden with ribbons and medals that even from 30 feet away, the authority was unmistakable. 2 stars gleamed on his shoulders, a major general. He removed his cap slowly, his gaze sweeping the congregation with an expression that could freeze blood. Then his eyes found Margaret, and something shifted in his face. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "But I couldn't let this ceremony proceed without saying something that needs to be said." Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. She'd never seen this man before in her life. What could a general possibly have to say about her shameful, borrowed wedding dress? The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that only exists when 200 people stop breathing at once. The general's boots struck the wooden floor with measured precision as he walked down the center aisle, his medals catching the light with each step. Margaret couldn't move. Her hand found Grace's shoulder, pulling her daughter close, as if proximity might shield them both from whatever was coming. Thomas had gone rigid beside her, his farmer's hands clenched into fists, not in aggression, but in the helpless posture of a man who knows he's about to witness something beyond his control. The general stopped 3 feet from the altar. Up close, Margaret could see he was younger than his bearing suggested, perhaps 45, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that had seen things no man should see. A long scar traced his jawline, the kind earned in combat, not accident. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Margaret directly, "that uniform you're wearing, may I ask where you acquired it?" The question landed like an accusation. Margaret felt every eye in the chapel boring into her back, every whisper crystallizing into certainty. She'd done something wrong, something illegal perhaps, wearing military property like this. "It was my husband's," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lieutenant Robert Hayes. He served on the USS Indianapolis before he was reassigned to convoy duty in the Pacific. He was lost at sea in 1942. The general's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "What was his rank when he died?" "Lieutenant. He'd just been promoted." "And his assignment?" Margaret's throat tightened. "Escort destroyer, the USS Eldridge. She went down off the Solomon Islands on November 18, 1942. All hands lost. They never recovered." Her voice cracked. "They never recovered any of the crew." The general nodded slowly. Then he turned to face the congregation, his voice ringing through the small chapel with parade ground clarity. "November 18, 1942. I remember that date because I should have died on it." A collective intake of breath rippled through the pews. "I was a captain then, commanding a Marine rifle company on Guadalcanal. We'd been pinned down for 6 days by Japanese artillery. No supplies, no reinforcement, 30% casualties. We'd radioed for evacuation, but every ship in the area was committed elsewhere. High Command had written us off." He paused, letting the weight settle. "Except one. One destroyer captain heard our distress call and disobeyed direct orders to maintain his convoy position. He broke formation, ran a gauntlet of enemy submarines and shore batteries, and got his ship close enough to provide covering fire while we evacuated our wounded. 97 Marines made it out alive because of that decision." Margaret felt the chapel spinning. Grace pressed against her, sighed, confused but sensing the shift in the room's energy. "That destroyer was the USS Eldridge. The captain who saved us was Robert Hayes." The words hung in the air like smoke. 3 weeks later, the general continued, his voice dropping, "The Eldridge was assigned to escort a convoy through hostile waters. They encountered a wolf pack of Japanese submarines. Hayes positioned his ship between the convoy and the enemy, drew their fire, bought enough time for 17 merchant vessels to escape. Every ship in that convoy made it home. The Eldridge did not." Margaret's knees buckled. Thomas caught her elbow, steadying her, but she barely felt his touch, The chapel had dissolved into a blur of faces, all of them transformed from judgment to something else. Shock, shame, dawning comprehension. 314 men served on those 17 merchant ships, the general said. Thousands of tons of medical supplies, ammunition, food rations. All of it reached our forces because one man chose to stand between danger and duty. Because Lieutenant Robert Hayes understood that leadership means sacrifice. He turned back to Margaret, and now his eyes were bright. Ma'am, I've spent 2 years trying to find you. The Navy's records were incomplete. Your husband's family had moved and you'd remarried, or so I'd been told. I came to Virginia following a rumor, hoping to find Robert Hayes's widow before it was too late. And I walk into this church to find you being mocked for wearing his uniform like it's something shameful. The general's voice rose, not in anger but in the kind of authority that reshapes reality. That uniform represents more courage than most of us will ever know. Your husband saved my life and the lives of 96 other men. He saved 17 ships and their crews. He died so that others could live. And he did it knowing exactly what the cost would be. A sound came from the back pews, someone sobbing openly now. So let me be clear, the general said, his gaze sweeping across the congregation. This woman is not wearing a costume. She's wearing the proof of heroism, and anyone who suggests otherwise can answer to me. Margaret couldn't speak, couldn't think. Grace tugged at her hand. Mama, is that true? Was Papa a hero? Before Margaret could answer, the general knelt down to Grace's eye level, his imposing presence softening into something almost gentle. Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, young lady, and you should be very, very proud. But as Margaret watched this decorated officer comfort her daughter, one question burned through her shock. Why had no one ever told her any of this before? Why had she spent 2 years believing Robert had died in some minor, forgotten skirmish, his sacrifice unrecognized and unremarked? What else had the Navy kept from her? The general rose to his feet, and something in his expression shifted. A shadow crossing his face that spoke of burdens carried in silence. Margaret saw it because she'd worn that same shadow for 2 years. The weight of grief mixed with questions no one would answer. There's more, he said quietly, reaching into his uniform jacket. Something I need to give you. Something the Navy couldn't release until now. He withdrew a manila envelope, its edges worn soft with handling. Margaret's hands trembled as she accepted it. Grace pressed against her side, Thomas standing uselessly behind them both. The congregation had gone still again, their earlier contempt transmuted into rapt attention. What is this? Margaret whispered. Your husband's final letter, and the truth about why you never received it. The envelope was sealed with red wax, official and imposing. Margaret's fingers found the edge, hesitated. Part of her wanted to tear it open immediately. Part of her feared what 2 years of silence might have been protecting her from. The general seemed to read her hesitation. Perhaps, he said gently, we should step outside. But Margaret was already breaking the seal. The wax crumbled, the envelope opened, and she withdrew 3 pieces of paper covered in Robert's familiar handwriting. The date at the top made her stomach drop. November 17th, 1942. 1 day before he died. Her vision blurred as she read the first lines. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then Captain Morrison has finally been allowed to deliver it, which means certain classified operations have been declassified, and I am, as we both feared, not coming home. I'm writing this in my quarters, knowing that tomorrow we sail into waters where the odds are not in our favor. but I need you to understand why I'm going anyway." Margaret's breath caught. Her eyes skipped down the page, hungry for his words, his voice, the pieces of him she'd lost. "The mission tomorrow is voluntary. High Command offered me the choice to decline." "We've already done our part," they said. "But there's a convoy carrying enough medical supplies to save thousands of lives, and intelligence suggests a Japanese submarine pack will intercept it unless someone draws them off. I've looked at the charts, studied the currents, calculated the risks. If the Eldridge positions herself correctly, we can buy the convoy enough time to reach safe waters. I know what you're thinking, that I'm choosing duty over you, over Grace, over the life we planned. But Margaret, if I choose safety while thousands die for want of medicine, how do I live with myself? How do I look our daughter in the eye and tell her that courage means running when others need you?" Margaret's hand shook so hard the paper rattled. Grace tugged at her dress. "Mama, what does it say?" But Margaret couldn't answer. She was reading further, her throat closing around words that felt like Robert speaking directly to her across the gulf of death. "I'm not throwing my life away. I'm spending it. There's a difference. One is waste, the other is purchase. And if my life can purchase the survival of those ships, those men, those supplies, then it's a price I'm willing to pay. I know you'll be angry. You'll feel abandoned. You'll curse me for leaving you alone with a child to raise and bills to pay, and a world that's not kind to widows. All of that is fair. But I need you to know that this choice doesn't mean I love you less. It means I love you enough to die protecting the kind of world I want you and Grace to live in." The letter continued, full of instructions about finances Margaret had never received, details about life insurance that had never materialized, information about where he'd hidden money in their house, money that would have kept her from poverty, from this desperate marriage to Thomas, from this humiliation in front of the entire community. Why? Margaret looked up at the general, fury suddenly cutting through her grief. Why didn't I receive this? Why didn't the Navy tell me any of this? The general's face hardened. Because 3 weeks after your husband died, the Navy realized they had a problem. The Eldridge's mission was part of a larger classified operation. If they honored Hayes's sacrifice publicly, they'd have to explain what he was doing there, which would compromise ongoing intelligence operations. So they buried it, listed him as killed in routine convoy duty, suppressed the letter, told Captain Morrison, me, that delivering it would violate national security protocols. National security. Margaret's voice was acid. My husband died a hero, and they buried the truth for national security? Yes. The general's jaw tightened. I fought them for 2 years. Went up the chain of command as far as I could go. Last month, enough operations concluded that they finally declassified the relevant files. That's when I got permission to find you and deliver the letter. Margaret looked down at the pages in her hands, at Robert's handwriting, at the proof that she'd spent 2 years believing herself forgotten when in fact she'd been deliberately erased. The Navy hadn't just failed to honor her husband. They'd actively hidden his sacrifice, leaving her to grieve in poverty and ignorance while bureaucrats protected their precious secrets. There's more, the general said quietly. He reached into his jacket again and withdrew a small black box. Your husband earned the Navy Cross for his actions that day. The citation was classified, never presented. I pulled every string I have to get this released. He opened the box. Inside, on blue velvet, lay a bronze cross suspended from a blue and white ribbon, one of the highest decorations the Navy could bestow. Margaret stared at it. This small piece of metal that represented everything Robert had been, everything he'd sacrificed, everything the government had stolen from her by keeping silent. "I don't want it," she heard herself say. The congregation gasped. Even Thomas stepped back, shocked. The general didn't flinch. "I understand." "Do you?" Margaret's voice rose, 2 years of suppressed rage finally finding its target. "Do you understand what it's like to be told your husband died for nothing? To watch your daughter ask why daddy isn't coming home and have no answer except he's gone? To stand in line at the relief office while women whisper about the widow who can't even afford proper black mourning clothes? To marry a man you don't love because the alternative is starvation?" She thrust the metal box back at him. "This doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring him back. It doesn't give Grace her father. It doesn't undo 2 years of humiliation and poverty and grief. It's just a piece of metal that lets the Navy feel better about burying the truth." The general took the box, but his expression remained steady. "You're right. It doesn't change what was done to you, but it might change what happens next." Margaret wiped her eyes roughly. "What does that mean?" "It means," the general said, "that I didn't come here just to deliver a letter. I came to offer you something the Navy owes you, and to make certain that what happened to you never happens to another military widow again." Behind them, the chapel doors opened again. 2 more officers entered, these carrying file folders thick with documents. The general gestured them forward. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband's death entitled you to a widow's pension, death benefits, and life insurance, none of which you received because the Navy classified his mission and couldn't process the paperwork without revealing information they wanted buried. As of this morning, all of that has been approved, backdated, and authorized for immediate payment." One of the officers handed Margaret a folder. Inside were forms, check stubs, official letters bearing Navy Department seals. $17,000 in back pay and benefits, the general said. "Enough to pay off any debts, buy a home, send your daughter to college if you choose. It's not what you're owed. Nothing could ever balance that scale. But it's what the law allows me to give you." Margaret stared at the numbers, her mind unable to process what they meant. $17,000. A fortune. Freedom. The ability to walk away from Thomas, from this loveless arrangement, from all of it. Grace tugged her dress again. "Mama, does this mean we don't have to move to Mr. Thomas's farm?" Every person in the chapel heard it. The innocent question that revealed exactly what this wedding had been. Not love, not choice. Desperation. Thomas's face went red. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked down the aisle without a word. The congregation parted like water, no one meeting his eyes. Margaret should have felt guilty. She felt only relief. But as she looked at the papers in her hands, at the proof of Robert's sacrifice and the Navy's betrayal, one question remained. Why had the general fought so hard for 2 years to find her and deliver this? What did he owe Robert Hayes that drove him to challenge his own chain of command? The answer, when it came in the next breath, would reframe everything she thought she understood about her husband's final mission. The general dismissed the other officers with a nod, waiting until their footsteps faded before he spoke again. The congregation remained frozen in their pews, witnesses to something that had transcended a simple wedding into a reckoning of a different kind. "There's a reason I fought so hard to find you," the general said quietly. "A reason that goes beyond duty or protocol, or even respect for a fallen hero." Margaret clutched Grace closer, the weight of the papers in her hand suddenly feeling heavier than mere documents. Something in the general's voice had shifted, the official bearing giving way to something rawer, more personal. "When your husband pulled the Eldridge out of formation to rescue my unit, he didn't just save 97 Marines. He saved my son." The words fell like stones into still water. "I didn't know I had a son," the general continued. "Not until 3 days after the evacuation. Private First Class Daniel Morrison, 19 years old, rifleman in Baker Company. I'd been estranged from his mother for years, a divorce that happened when I was a junior officer, too proud and too stupid to fight for what mattered. Daniel enlisted under his mother's maiden name. I didn't even know he was in my unit until they were loading the wounded onto the Eldridge and someone called out, 'Morrison,' and I turned to see a kid who had my eyes staring back at me." The general's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat, military discipline reasserting itself, but the emotion remained visible beneath the surface. He'd taken shrapnel to the chest. Field medics said he had maybe an hour if we didn't get him to a ship with proper medical facilities. Your husband saw us loading stretchers and radioed down to his medical officer, told them to prep for surgery. Then he stood on the bridge and navigated through waters that should have killed us all. Japanese guns firing from the shore, submarines prowling the depths, and he got us out." Margaret felt something in her chest crack open. Not grief this time, but understanding. This wasn't just about honor or duty. This was about a father's debt to the man who saved his child. "Daniel survived," the general said. 3 surgeries on the Eldridge, 2 more when we got him stateside. He'll walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he'll walk. He finished his degree last spring. He's getting married in December." Grace spoke up, her child's voice cutting through the heavy adult emotions. "So my papa saved your boy, and now you're helping my mama?" The general looked down at her, and for the first time since he'd entered the chapel, he smiled. "That's exactly right, young lady. Though I'm afraid I'm not doing a very good job of it." "You brought us money," Grace said, with the practical logic of 7-year-olds. "That seems helpful." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the congregation, the first sound that wasn't shame or shock or silence. Margaret felt the tension in the room shift, the weight of judgment finally beginning to lift. But the general wasn't finished. "Mrs. Hayes, the money is yours by right, but I have something else to offer, something that might matter more in the long term." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been given command of a new Veterans Advocacy Office in Washington. Our job is to ensure that military families receive the benefits and support they're entitled to, and to prevent what happened to you from happening to others. I need someone who understands the system's failures from the inside. Someone who knows what it costs when bureaucracy prioritizes secrecy over people." Margaret stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" "A position. With housing in Washington, education stipend for your daughter, full federal benefits. You'd be helping other widows navigate the same system that failed you, making sure their husbands' sacrifices aren't buried under classified stamps and administrative cowardice." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown across dark water. Washington. A real job, purpose beyond survival. Grace could go to good schools, have opportunities that a small Virginia town could never provide. Margaret could take her grief, her rage, her intimate knowledge of how the system crushed the people it was supposed to protect, and turn it into something that mattered. "I need to think about it," she heard herself say. "Of course." The general reached into his pocket and withdrew a card. "My office number. Call anytime, day or night. The position will be held for you as long as you need to decide." He turned to address the congregation, his command voice returning. "I apologize for interrupting your ceremony, but I hope you understand why it was necessary. Lieutenant Hayes deserved better than silence, and his widow deserved better than judgment." The words landed like an indictment. Several people in the front pews had the grace to look ashamed. Others stared at their laps, unable or unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The general replaced his cap, executed a precise salute toward Margaret, and turned to leave. He'd made it 3 steps down the aisle when Grace's voice rang out. "Wait!" He stopped, turned back. Grace had pulled free from Margaret's side and was running toward him, her Sunday dress fluttering. She stopped directly in front of the general and held out her hand with all the solemnity a 7-year-old could muster. "Thank you for telling us about Papa. Mama cries at night sometimes, and she thinks I don't know. But I do. Maybe now she won't cry as much." The general knelt down, this decorated officer, this man who commanded thousands, and shook Grace's small hand with complete seriousness. "Your father would be very proud of you," he said. "And I promise you, as long as I'm alive, your family will never be forgotten again." Grace threw her arms around his neck in an impulsive hug. The general stiffened for a moment. Then his arms came up to return the embrace, and Margaret saw his shoulders shake once, twice, with emotion he could no longer fully contain. When Grace finally released him, the general stood, nodded once more to Margaret, and walked out of the chapel into the November sunshine. The congregation sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the back pews, someone began to clap. Another person joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire chapel was on its feet, applause rolling through the small space like thunder, and Margaret realized they weren't clapping for her. They were clapping for Robert, for the sacrifice they'd never known about, for the hero who died in silence while they'd gone on with their lives in ignorance. She stood at the altar in her husband's uniform, her daughter at her side, and let the recognition wash over her. Not for herself, for him. The preacher approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand if you'd like to postpone." "There's nothing to postpone," Margaret said clearly. "There won't be a wedding today." She saw Thomas's empty place where he should have been standing, felt the weight of the papers in her hand, and understood with perfect clarity that her life had just split into 2 possible futures. One where she stayed in this small town, accepted charity and diminished expectations, raised Grace in the shadow of who Robert had been, and another where she took the general's offer, went to Washington, turned her pain into purpose. It wasn't even a choice, really. She looked down at Grace. "How would you feel about moving to a big city, meeting new people, helping other families like ours?" Grace's eyes went wide. "Would there be museums? Miss Porter says Washington has lots of museums." "Lots of museums," Margaret confirmed, feeling something loosen in her chest, something that had been locked tight since the day the telegram arrived. But even as the decision crystallized, one question still haunted her. Robert's letter had mentioned money hidden in their house, insurance policies she'd never seen, documents that should have reached her. If the general had finally gotten the Navy to release everything, where was the rest of it? And more troubling still, if powerful men in Washington had worked so hard to bury her husband's sacrifice, what would they do when she arrived in their city, determined to expose how the system had failed her and countless others? The house Margaret had shared with Robert sat at the edge of town, a small clapboard structure with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged on one side. She'd been 3 months behind on the mortgage when Thomas proposed, and the bank had been sending letters with increasingly urgent language. Now, with the general's papers tucked under her arm and Grace skipping ahead up the walkway, she saw the house differently, not as a millstone dragging her under, but as a puzzle Robert had left for her to solve. The letter mentioned money hidden here, she said to Grace as they stepped inside. The familiar smell of the place wrapped around her. Old wood, the faint ghost of Robert's pipe tobacco, the lavender sachets she kept in the linen closet. He said he'd prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't come home. Grace was already racing from room to room, her child's enthusiasm unburdened by the weight of 2 years' grief. Where would Papa hide money? In the walls? Under the floorboards? Mama, this is like a treasure hunt. Margaret set the papers on the kitchen table and withdrew Robert's letter again, reading the relevant passage more carefully. If the Navy acts as I fear they might, if they classify the mission and bury the truth, you'll need resources they won't give you. I've taken precautions. Check the places that mattered to us. The bookshelf first, then the place where we kept time. Finally, where we planted hope. Riddles. Even facing death, Robert had been careful, protecting information in case the wrong people found the letter first. Margaret closed her eyes, thinking back to their life together, the small domestic rituals that had made a house into a home. The bookshelf first. She moved to the living room, where Robert's collection of naval histories and adventure novels still sat gathering dust. She'd been unable to touch them after he died, as if disturbing his books might somehow erase the last evidence that he'd existed. Now she ran her fingers along the spines, looking for, what? A false cover? A hollowed-out book? Grace appeared at her elbow. Papa used to read to me from that one, she said, pointing to a worn copy of Treasure Island. He'd do all the pirate voices. Margaret pulled it from the shelf. The book fell open naturally to a middle chapter, and tucked inside was an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in Robert's handwriting. For Margaret, emergency fund. Inside were $50 bills, 20 of them, carefully folded. $1,000. More cash than Margaret had seen in one place in years. Her hands shook as she counted them. Is that a lot of money? Grace asked. It's a lot of money, sweetheart. But the letter had mentioned multiple hiding places. The place where we kept time. Margaret moved to the mantel, where an old clock stood, a wedding gift from Robert's parents, its brass mechanism long since stopped because she couldn't afford to have it repaired. She picked it up, felt its unusual weight, and found the small catch on the bottom that released the base. Inside the hollow chamber sat a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Margaret unwrapped them carefully, spreading the contents across the kitchen table. Life insurance policies, 3 of them, from different companies, each naming her as beneficiary. The policies were dated from 1941, before Robert's final deployment, and together they totaled $25,000. $25,000 the Navy had never mentioned. $25,000 that would have kept her and Grace comfortable for years. That would have meant she never had to consider marrying Thomas, never had to stand in that chapel wearing a dress made from her dead husband's uniform while neighbors sneered. Why wouldn't the Navy have told me about these? She whispered. But she knew. If they'd acknowledged the insurance, they would have had to process death benefits, which would have required explaining how Robert died, which would have compromised their precious classified operations. So they'd simply forgotten, left her to drown while paperwork gathered dust in some bureaucrat's filing cabinet. Grace tugged at her sleeve. Mama, what's the last place? Where you planted hope? Margaret's breath caught. She knew exactly what Robert meant. The backyard garden, where they'd planted a cherry tree the spring before he deployed. They'd chosen it together at a nursery, dug the hole side by side, and Robert had joked about how they'd harvest cherries with their grandchildren someday. The tree had survived his absence, growing despite Margaret's neglect, its branches now reaching toward the November sky. She found a shovel in the shed and began to dig at the base of the tree, Grace watching with wide eyes. 6 inches down, the shovel struck something solid, metal. Margaret dropped to her knees and used her hands to clear the soil, revealing a waterproof ammunition box, its seal still intact. Inside was a letter, not to her this time, but to Grace. Dated November 16th, 1942, 2 days before he died. My darling Grace, you're only 5 years old as I write this, too young to understand why Daddy has to go away. But someday you'll be old enough to ask questions, and I want you to have answers. I want you to know that I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I loved you so much that I was willing to die protecting the world you'll grow up in. In this box, you'll find bonds in your name, enough to pay for your education, to give you choices your mother and I never had. Use them wisely. Become someone who makes the world better, not someone who simply survives in it. And take care of your mother. She's stronger than she knows, but she'll need you to remind her of that sometimes. All my love. Always. Your Papa. Margaret read the letter aloud, her voice breaking on every other word while Grace cried silently beside her. Beneath the letter were war bonds, 20 of them, each worth $500 at maturity. $10,000 for Grace's future, buried beneath a tree that symbolized hope and growth and the stubborn persistence of life. Robert had prepared for everything. He'd seen the possibility that the Navy would abandon his family, and he'd created a safety net woven from insurance policies and hidden cash and investments that couldn't be confiscated or classified or forgotten. He'd known, walking into his final mission, that bureaucracy might value secrecy over his widow's survival, and he'd been exactly right. Margaret sat in the dirt beneath the cherry tree, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's foresight and love, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. For 2 years, she'd survived on anger and grief and the bitter determination to simply keep breathing. Now she had something else. Resources, agency, the means to fight back. "Mama," Grace said softly, "are we going to be okay now?" Margaret pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of her hair, the realness of her. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be more than okay." But even as she said it, she thought about the general's offer, the job in Washington, the chance to help other widows navigate the same system that had crushed her. The money Robert had hidden would give her freedom, but the position would give her purpose. She thought about the people in that chapel, the ones who'd whispered and judged and looked away when she needed help. She thought about Thomas, who'd offered marriage not out of love, but out of the arithmetic of necessity. She thought about the Navy bureaucrats who'd filed Robert's sacrifice under classified and moved on with their comfortable lives. And she thought about other women like her, struggling in silence, told their husbands had died in minor skirmishes, denied benefits because paperwork was too complicated, or missions were too sensitive, or the truth was simply too inconvenient to acknowledge. The decision crystallized with perfect clarity. She would take every dollar Robert had left her, and she would go to Washington. She would accept the general's position, and she would make it her mission to ensure that no other widow ever stood in a chapel wearing her husband's uniform while strangers mocked her poverty and grief. Robert had spent his life. She would spend what remained of hers making sure that sacrifice meant something, but first, she needed to go back to that chapel one more time. There was something she had to do, something that would require more courage than running away to Washington. She had to face the people who judged her and show them exactly what their cruelty had cost. Grace looked up at her, reading the determination in her mother's face. "Where are we going?" "To finish what we started," Margaret said, standing and brushing the dirt from her dress. The dress made from Robert's uniform, the dress she would never be ashamed of again. The chapel was nearly empty when Margaret pushed through the doors for the second time that day. A few lingering congregants were collecting hymnals and folding bulletins, going through the motions of tidying after a ceremony that had never reached its conclusion. They looked up as Margaret entered, Grace at her side, and Margaret saw the flash of discomfort cross their faces, the instinct to look away, to pretend they hadn't been part of what happened that morning. She wouldn't let them. "I'd like everyone to stay, please," Margaret said, her voice carrying through the small space with unexpected authority. "Those of you who are still here and anyone else within earshot. What I have to say won't take long." Mrs. Henshaw, who taught Sunday school and had been one of the loudest whispers during the ceremony, clutched her purse to her chest. "Margaret, dear, I think we've all had quite enough drama for one day. Sit down, Barbara." The command in Margaret's voice stopped Mrs. Henshaw mid-retreat. Several other women who'd been edging toward the exit froze. Slowly, reluctantly, they returned to their pews. Within minutes, word had spread through the church basement, where volunteers were cleaning up from the reception that never happened, and more people began filtering back into the chapel. Margaret waited until perhaps 40 people had assembled, not the full congregation from this morning, but enough. Enough witnesses. Enough accountability. She stood at the front of the chapel, Grace beside her, still wearing the uniform dress that had sparked such contempt hours earlier. The November light streaming through the stained glass windows painted her in colors of crimson and gold. "This morning," Margaret began, "many of you looked at me with disgust. You whispered about my dress, my choices, my poverty. You mocked me for wearing my husband's uniform as if it were a shameful thing. And I stood here and accepted your judgment because I'd been taught that widows should be grateful for whatever scraps of charity they receive." She paused, letting the words settle. "But I'm done being grateful for cruelty disguised as concern. I'm done accepting shame for circumstances I didn't create. So I want to tell you what I learned today. What you should have known all along if any of you had bothered to ask instead of whisper." Margaret gestured to Grace, who held up the Navy Cross in its presentation box, the metal gleaming even in the muted chapel light. "My husband, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, earned this medal for saving 97 Marines on Guadalcanal. He disobeyed orders to leave them behind. He risked his ship and crew to evacuate wounded men while Japanese guns fired from the shore. 3 weeks later, he positioned his destroyer between a convoy of supply ships and a pack of enemy submarines. 17 merchant vessels made it home because Robert Hayes chose to stand between them and death. His ship didn't survive. None of his crew did. 314 men on those merchant ships lived because my husband died." The chapel was absolutely silent now. Mrs. Henshaw had gone pale. "The Navy classified his mission," Margaret continued, her voice steady and cold. "They buried his sacrifice under national security protocols. They never told me how he died. They never processed his death benefits or insurance. They let me lose my home, beg for charity, accept a marriage proposal from a man I didn't love. All because it was more convenient to let one widow suffer than to acknowledge what had really happened." She opened the folder the general had given her, held up the paperwork showing the backdated benefits. $17,000. That's what the Navy owed me for 2 years, while I stood in relief lines and wore dresses made from curtains. That's what they kept from me and my daughter, while bureaucrats in Washington decided that classified operations mattered more than the families of the men who died for them. Someone in the back pews made a soft sound of dismay. Margaret pressed on, her anger a controlled burn now, purposeful rather than wild. But here's what I really want you to understand. The Navy failed me through bureaucracy and indifference. You failed me through active choice. You saw a widow struggling and you responded with judgment instead of compassion. You saw a little girl who'd lost her father, and you whispered about her mother's shame instead of offering help. You saw someone wearing a uniform and you mocked it without ever asking what that uniform represented. Margaret moved down from the altar, walking slowly through the center aisle, making eye contact with person after person. Mrs. Henshaw, you told your bridge club that I was setting a bad example for young women, that I should have planned better, instead of falling into poverty. Mr. Patterson, you refused to extend credit at your store, said I was a bad risk. Mrs. Cole, you crossed the street rather than speak to me in town. All of you participated in making my life harder while pretending it was for my own good. She stopped in the center of the chapel, Grace still beside her, small and brave. I'm not telling you this because I want your apologies. I'm telling you because I need you to understand what you did. You had a choice every single day to show kindness to someone who was drowning, and you chose judgment instead. You had the opportunity to ask questions, to offer help, to extend basic human decency, and you chose gossip and condemnation. Mrs. Henshaw stood suddenly, her face flushed. Margaret, we didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't care enough to find out. Margaret's voice cut through the excuse like a knife. My husband's sacrifice was classified, yes, but my poverty wasn't. My struggle wasn't. The fact that Grace wore the same dress to school 3 days a week wasn't classified information. It was visible to anyone who looked. And you all looked. You just chose to judge what you saw instead of helping. She let the silence stretch, watching as realization and shame settled over the faces in the pews. Some people were crying now. Others stared at their laps, unable to meet her eyes. I'm leaving, Margaret said finally. I've been offered a position in Washington, helping other military widows navigate the system that failed me. I'm going to take every dollar my husband left me, and I'm going to use it to make sure that what happened to me never happens to another woman whose husband died protecting this country. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back one last time. When I'm gone, I want you to remember this day. I want you to remember that you had the chance to be the kind of community that takes care of its own, and you chose to be the kind that kicks people when they're down. And I want you to ask yourselves, the next time you see someone struggling, the next time you're tempted to whisper instead of help, what kind of person will you choose to be? Grace tugged at her hand. Mama, can we go now? Yes, sweetheart. We can go. They walked down the aisle together, past the silent congregation, past the altar where Margaret had almost married a man she didn't love, past the doors into the November afternoon. Behind them, no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of their collective failure hung in the air like incense. Margaret didn't look back. Outside, the general's car was still parked in the small lot, as if he'd known she would need it. He stood beside it, waiting with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to duty. I accept your offer, Margaret said without preamble. When do we leave? The general's face broke into a genuine smile. There's a train to Washington tomorrow morning. I've already arranged temporary housing near the office. You'll need time to pack, settle your affairs. I can be ready by dawn, Margaret interrupted. There's nothing in this town I need to settle. She looked at Grace, who was already imagining museums and adventures and a life bigger than this small Virginia town could offer. Actually, Margaret corrected herself, There's one thing I need to do first." An hour later, she walked into the county courthouse and filed the paperwork to establish the Lieutenant Robert Hayes Memorial Fund, a trust using half the money he'd hidden, dedicated to supporting military widows and their children. The other half would support her and Grace in Washington, give them the cushion they needed while she learned her new role. As she signed the final document, Margaret realized what Robert had given her wasn't just money or insurance policies. It was the freedom to choose what kind of person she wanted to be in the face of injustice. He'd spent his life protecting others. Now she would do the same, in a different way, fighting bureaucracy instead of enemy ships, but fighting nonetheless. That night, packing their few belongings into borrowed suitcases, Margaret heard Grace singing softly to herself, a tune Robert used to hum while doing dishes. "Papa would be proud of you, Mama," Grace said sleepily from her bed. "I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so." But as Margaret turned out the light and lay in the darkness of the house she'd soon leave forever, one thought kept her awake. Washington was full of the same men who'd buried Robert's sacrifice, who'd prioritized classification over compassion, who'd let her suffer rather than admit their mistakes. What would they do when she arrived, armed with her story and her determination to change the very system they'd built to protect themselves? The train pulled into Washington's Union Station on a cold morning in late November 1944, steam hissing from the brakes and the platform crowded with servicemen and civilians moving through the grand space like currents in a restless sea. Margaret stepped onto the platform with Grace's hand clutched tightly in hers, their two suitcases containing everything they owned, and looked up at the vaulted ceiling arching 90 feet above them. "It's like a castle," Grace whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Margaret felt the enormity of the place pressing down on her, not just the physical scale of Union Station, but the weight of the city beyond it. Washington was power and politics, and the machinery that had chewed up her husband's sacrifice and spit out silence. Somewhere in this city were the offices where men had stamped Robert's file classified and moved on to their next piece of paperwork. Somewhere here were the bureaucrats who'd decided that protecting operational security mattered more than protecting a widow and her child. She was about to walk into their world and demand they do better. "Mrs. Hayes." The general appeared through the crowd, somehow visible despite the chaos around them. He'd traded his dress uniform for a simple suit, but the bearing remained unmistakable. The straight spine, the economy of movement, the way people unconsciously stepped aside to let him pass. "Welcome to Washington," he said, taking their suitcases without asking. "The apartment is ready. I thought you might want to settle in before we discuss the position." But as they moved through the station toward the exit, Margaret noticed how people looked at the general, the quick glances, the whispered recognition, the occasional nod from men in uniform who clearly knew his reputation. And she noticed something else. The way his jaw tightened when those glances lingered, the way his shoulders drew back as if preparing for confrontation. "You're not popular here," she observed quietly once they were in the car he'd arranged. The general's hands tightened on the steering wheel. 2 years of fighting the Navy Department over a classified letter doesn't win friends. I made enemies in offices that matter, called out officers who outrank me, went over heads and around regulations trying to get you what you were owed. "Why?" Margaret asked. "Your son survived. You repaid your debt to Robert by finding me, delivering the letter. You could have stopped there." The general was quiet for several blocks, navigating through traffic with practiced efficiency. Grace had fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder, exhausted from the journey and the emotions of the past 24 hours. "I told you Daniel survived," the general said finally. What I didn't tell you is that he tried to kill himself 6 months after we brought him home." Margaret's breath caught. The wounds healed, but something inside him didn't. He couldn't sleep, couldn't keep food down, would wake up screaming about drowning, about fire, about watching his friends die. The doctors called it combat exhaustion, war neurosis, gave him pills that made him sleep but didn't stop the nightmares. The general's voice had gone flat, carefully controlled. One night I came home and found him in the garage with the car running. Dear God. I got him out in time, got him to a hospital, then to a specialist who actually knew how to treat what we now call battle fatigue. It took a year of treatment, but Daniel came back to himself. He's whole now, or as whole as anyone can be after seeing what he saw. The general pulled up in front of a modest apartment building in a quiet neighborhood, cut the engine, but didn't move to get out. The night I found Daniel in that garage, I realized something. Your husband didn't just save my son's body on Guadalcanal. He saved his future, gave him the chance to heal, to recover, to become the man he is now. And while Daniel was getting that chance, getting the best medical care and psychological treatment the military could provide, you were standing in relief lines because the Navy had buried your husband's sacrifice and forgotten you existed. He finally turned to look at her. That's why I fought for 2 years. Not just because I owed Robert Hayes a debt, but because the inequality of it was obscene. My son got everything the military could give him because I had rank and connections and the ability to demand better treatment. You got nothing because you had no one to fight for you. That's not honor. That's not what any of these men are dying for. Margaret understood then. This wasn't about one widow or one classified mission. It was about a fundamental injustice in how the military treated its own, protecting the families of officers while abandoning the families of enlisted men, providing resources to those with connections while ignoring those without advocates. The position you're offering, she said slowly, it's not just administrative work, is it? No. The general's expression was grim. It's warfare, Mrs. Hayes. Bureaucratic warfare against a system that's designed to protect itself at the expense of the people who sacrifice for it. You'll be fighting regulations written to deny benefits, protocols designed to discourage claims, officers who believe their convenience matters more than your pain. You'll make enemies. You'll be opposed by people with more power and experience than you. It will be difficult and frustrating, and sometimes it will feel impossible. He paused. But you'll also save lives. You'll help widows who don't know how to navigate the system. You'll find the benefits they're entitled to but have been denied. You'll be the advocate they don't have, the person who fights when they're too exhausted or grief-stricken or intimidated to fight for themselves. You'll do for others what I tried to do for you. Grace stirred against Margaret's shoulder, murmuring something in her sleep. Margaret looked down at her daughter, this brave, resilient little girl who'd lost her father and watched her mother nearly drown in poverty and grief, and who somehow still believed the world could be good and fair and kind. When do I start? Margaret asked. The general smiled, not the polite professional expression, but something genuine and relieved. Monday. That gives you the weekend to get settled. But Mrs. Hayes, I need you to understand something. The men who buried your husband's sacrifice, they're still here, still in positions of power. And when they realize what you're doing, when they see you helping other widows expose the same negligence and indifference they showed you, they'll come after you. They'll question your credentials, your motives, your right to be here. They'll try to discredit you or silence you or make your life difficult enough that you quit. Let them try, Margaret said quietly. I've survived worse than bureaucrats with hurt feelings. The apartment was small but clean. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with actual counter space, windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street where children played. It was more space than Margaret and Grace had ever had, and it came furnished with simple but serviceable furniture. The general had even arranged for groceries to be delivered, basic supplies stocked in the cupboards. "The Navy's paying for this?" Margaret asked, looking around. "The government is. It's part of your compensation package. Housing allowance, education stipend for Grace, health benefits, pension contributions. Everything you should have had from the beginning." After the general left, Margaret and Grace explored their new home room by room. Grace claimed the smaller bedroom, already planning where she'd put her few toys and the books she loved. Margaret stood in the kitchen, running her hand along the counter, and allowed herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated relief. They were safe. They had resources. They had a future. But Sunday evening, as Margaret prepared for her first day of work, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find a man in a Navy captain's uniform, his expression cold and formal. "Mrs. Margaret Hayes?" "Yes?" "I'm Captain Thornton, Navy Personnel Administration. I need to speak with you about your husband's service record and certain irregularities that have come to light regarding your benefits claim." Margaret's stomach dropped. It had started already, less than 48 hours in Washington, and someone was questioning her right to what she'd been given. "What kind of irregularities?" "May I come in?" Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside. Captain Thornton entered, his eyes cataloging the apartment with the same cold assessment he'd given her. "Mrs. Hayes, it's come to our attention that you've received a substantial sum in backdated benefits based on claims that your husband's death was classified under national security protocols. However, our records show no such classification. Lieutenant Hayes died in routine convoy operations. The Navy Cross citation you claim exists is not in our official database, and the insurance policies you've presented appear to have been purchased through private channels that the Navy didn't authorize." Each word landed like a blow. Margaret felt the floor tilting beneath her. General Morrison delivered those documents himself. He said they'd been declassified, that everything had been approved. "General Morrison is currently under investigation for abuse of authority," Captain Thornton said flatly. "It appears he may have fabricated certain documents and pressured junior officers to process claims that weren't legitimate. We're conducting a full audit of all benefits paid out under his direction. Until that audit is complete, I'm afraid I'll need to ask you to return the funds you received and vacate this apartment." Margaret stared at him, the words not quite processing. Fabricated? The general had lied? But she'd seen Robert's letter, held the Navy Cross, read the insurance policies. "I don't understand. Are you saying my husband wasn't a hero? That he didn't save those Marines?" Captain Thornton's expression didn't change. "I'm saying we have no official record of the events General Morrison described. And until we can verify his claims independently, the Navy cannot continue to provide benefits based on potentially false information." He pulled an envelope from his jacket and handed it to her. "This is formal notice of the audit and suspension of benefits. You have 30 days to comply. If you have questions, the contact information is included." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand this must be difficult, but the Navy has protocols for a reason. We can't simply pay out large sums based on one man's unsupported claims, regardless of his rank or reputation. I'm sure you understand." Then he was gone, and Margaret stood in the middle of her new apartment, the apartment she now had 30 days to leave, holding a letter that stripped away everything she'd gained in the past 2 days. Behind her, Grace appeared in the doorway of her bedroom, clutching her teddy bear. "Mama, who was that man? Why did he make you sad?" Margaret couldn't answer. She was thinking about the general's face when he'd talked about fighting for 2 years, about the enemies he'd made. She was thinking about how easily powerful men could rewrite reality, make heroes disappear, turn sacrifice into bureaucratic inconvenience. And she was thinking about what Robert would do in this moment. Whether he'd run, or whether he'd stand and fight even when the odds were impossible. The answer came to her with perfect clarity. She picked up the phone and dialed the number on the general's card. "General Morrison," she said when he answered. "We need to talk. Right now." Because if they were going to call her husband's sacrifice a lie, if they were going to erase Robert's heroism to punish the general for fighting too hard, then Margaret Hayes would make them prove it, and she would make sure the whole world watched while they tried. The general's office was tucked into a nondescript building 3 blocks from the Capitol, the kind of place designed to be overlooked amid the marble monuments and imposing facades that defined official Washington. Margaret arrived before dawn on Monday morning, Grace in tow because she had nowhere else to leave her, both of them exhausted from a sleepless night spent reviewing documents and planning what came next. The general looked worse than Margaret felt, unshaven, his eyes shadowed, his uniform rumpled as if he'd slept in it. Papers covered every surface of his small office, and she realized with a jolt that he'd been working through the night as well. "They moved faster than I expected," he said without preamble. "Captain Thornton is Admiral Whitmore's lapdog. Whitmore's the one who classified your husband's mission in the first place, and he spent 2 years blocking my attempts to declassify it. Now he's using my fight for you as an excuse to discredit everything I've done." Margaret set Grace in a chair with a book and moved to the desk, studying the documents spread across it. "Are they right? Did you fabricate anything?" "No." The word was absolute, no hesitation. "Every document I gave you is legitimate. Every claim I made about Robert's service is backed by official records. But Whitmore controls access to those records, and he's buried them so deep that proving they exist will require—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "It will require things I can't do alone." "Then tell me what you need." The general looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing her resolve, her capability, her willingness to do what was necessary. "There's a vault," he said finally. "Navy Department archive facility in Alexandria. It holds all the classified operational records from the Pacific Theater. Whitmore has the only key to the section containing the Eldridge files. But there's a junior archivist there, Ensign Patricia Reeves. She's helped me before. Let me review files when Whitmore wasn't looking, made copies of documents I needed. If we can get her to pull the complete Eldridge file, we'll have proof that everything I told you is true. And if Captain Thornton finds out you're still pursuing this, they'll court-martial me for insubordination, strip my rank, destroy my career, potentially bring criminal charges for abuse of authority." The general's voice was matter-of-fact. "But they can't do worse to me than what silence does to people like you, and to every other widow who's been told her sacrifice doesn't matter enough to acknowledge." Margaret thought about the chapel in Virginia, the whispers and judgment, the years of poverty and shame. She thought about Robert's letter, his careful preparations, his certainty that the Navy would abandon her. And she thought about Grace, who deserved to grow up knowing that her father had been a hero, not a footnote buried in classified files. "How do we get to Ensign Reeves?" The archive facility was a converted warehouse. its exterior unmarked except for a small Navy Department placard beside a reinforced door. Margaret and the general arrived separately, she as a widow seeking information about her husband's service, he as a general conducting routine oversight. Grace stayed behind with a sympathetic neighbor the general had found, a retired schoolteacher who'd lost her own husband at Midway and understood what was at stake. Ensign Reeves was younger than Margaret expected, barely 25, with nervous eyes and ink-stained fingers from hours of filing and cataloging. She met Margaret in a small reading room while the general waited outside, officially reviewing unrelated documents. "Mrs. Hayes," Reeves said quietly, sliding a file folder across the table. "I could lose my position for this, possibly face charges for mishandling classified material. I know. And I'm grateful. I'm not doing it for gratitude." Reeves's voice was firm despite her obvious fear. "I'm doing it because I've spent a year filing reports about men who died and watching officers bury their sacrifices under classification stamps because it's convenient. I'm doing it because the system is broken, and someone needs to be brave enough to say so." She opened the folder, revealing page after page of operational reports, radio transcripts, and witness statements, all bearing the classification stamp that had kept them hidden for 2 years. "This is everything," Reeves said. "The Eldridge's mission orders, the radio traffic from Guadalcanal, witness statements from the Marines who were evacuated, the after-action report describing how Lieutenant Hayes intercepted the submarine pack. It's all here. Everything the general told you is documented and verified." Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the pages, reading Robert's voice in the radio transcripts, seeing his decisions laid out in official language. Here was the moment he chose to break formation. Here was the calculation that his ship could draw fire long enough for the convoy to escape. Here was the final transmission before the Eldridge went silent. "Why did they classify this?" Margaret whispered. "Because admitting they lost a destroyer saving a convoy would have required explaining why the convoy was so valuable. And the convoy was carrying components for a classified weapons program, something called the Manhattan Project. The Navy decided that protecting that secret was more important than honoring the men who died for it." The Manhattan Project. Margaret had heard whispers about some kind of superweapon being developed, something that might end the war. Robert had died protecting it, and the government had buried his sacrifice to keep their secret safe. "I need copies," Margaret said. "Everything in this file. Can you—" The door burst open. Captain Thornton stood in the doorway, his face flushed with fury, 2 shore patrol officers behind him. "Ensign Reeves, step away from that table. Mrs. Hayes, you're in unauthorized possession of classified material. General Morrison—" He spotted the general entering from the adjacent room. "You are hereby relieved of duty pending investigation for breach of security protocols." But the general was smiling, the cold, satisfied smile of a man who'd just won a battle his opponent didn't know had been fought. "Actually, Captain, I'm here on direct orders from Secretary of the Navy Forrestal. Orders I received at 0500 this morning after I sent him a full report on Admiral Whitmore's pattern of misclassifying operational records to cover up administrative negligence. The Secretary was quite interested to learn that widows have been systematically denied benefits because certain officers find it easier to stamp classified on anything that might reflect poorly on their decisions." Thornton went pale. You can't." "I can. And I did. Furthermore, Secretary Forrestal has ordered a full review of all Pacific Theater classifications related to personnel casualties. Any file that was classified solely to protect operational security around the Manhattan Project, which as of last month is no longer classified, will be immediately declassified and released to the appropriate family members. The general pulled an envelope from his jacket, handed it to Thornton. "Those are your orders, Captain. You're to cooperate fully with this review, and Admiral Whitmore has been summoned to Washington to explain why he personally blocked multiple legitimate requests for information about the Eldridge mission. I expect he'll have trouble providing a satisfactory answer." Margaret watched Thornton read the orders, saw the moment he realized he'd lost. Behind him, Ensign Reeves allowed herself the smallest smile of satisfaction. "Mrs. Hayes," the general said, turning to her, "on behalf of the United States Navy, I apologize for the unconscionable delay in recognizing your husband's service. The complete Eldridge file will be declassified by end of business today, and full benefits will be restored immediately. Additionally, the Navy will be issuing a formal posthumous commendation and arranging for a proper memorial service with full military honors." Margaret couldn't speak. 2 years of fighting, 2 days of hope followed by crushing reversal, and now this. Vindication, recognition, justice. "There's one more thing," the general said quietly. He pulled out a small newspaper clipping, handed it to her. This ran in the Washington Post this morning. The headline read, "Navy Widow Reveals Pattern of Benefit Denials. Classified Missions Used to Avoid Paying Families." Below it was Margaret's story, not the details of Robert's mission, but the broader pattern of how classification had been weaponized against widows, how bureaucracy had become a tool for avoiding obligations, how the very system meant to honor sacrifice had instead compounded grief with indifference. "I didn't authorize. I leaked it," the general said simply. "Last night after you called, because Thornton's visit told me that Whitmore was going to try to bury this quietly, make you the problem instead of the system. So I made sure it couldn't be buried. By noon, every newspaper in the country will be running variations of this story. Public pressure will force the Navy to conduct the review they should have done years ago. Other widows will come forward. The system will have to change because the alternative is a public relations catastrophe." Margaret looked at the clipping, at her name in print, at the exposure she'd never asked for, but that might save others from her fate. "I'll lose my job over this," the general continued. "Secretary Forrestal's orders will protect me from court-martial, but my career is effectively over. No one will trust an officer who leaks to the press, even for the right reasons. I'll likely be quietly retired within 6 months." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and meant it. "Don't be. I spent 20 years climbing ranks and chasing promotions. The last 2 years fighting for you and other families like yours. That's the only work I've done that actually mattered. If my career ends because I chose people over protocol, I'll count it as the best decision I ever made." He extended his hand. "Welcome to the Veterans Advocacy Office, Mrs. Hayes. Your position is secure, your benefits are permanent, and your work starts today. There are 17 other widows currently fighting the same battles you fought. I thought you might want to help them." Margaret shook his hand, feeling the calluses of a career soldier who'd finally found something worth more than rank or reputation. "When do I meet them?" "They're waiting in the conference room." 3 years later, on a spring morning in 1947, Margaret stood at Arlington National Cemetery, watching them dedicate a memorial to the USS Eldridge and her crew. Grace was 10 now, tall and confident, holding a folded flag that would be placed at the base of the granite marker bearing her father's name. The Veterans Advocacy Office had helped 432 families recover denied benefits. Admiral Whitmore had been quietly retired. Captain Thornton had been reassigned to a desk job in Alaska. Ensign Reeves had been promoted and now ran the archive facility, ensuring that classification could never again be used to erase sacrifice. and the general, retired now at his own request, stood beside his son Daniel, watching the ceremony with the satisfaction of a man who'd finally balanced his accounts. "Do you think Papa knows?" Grace whispered, as the honor guard fired their salute. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "I think he knows, and I think he's proud." As they laid the memorial wreath, Margaret thought about that November morning in the Virginia chapel, standing in her husband's uniform while neighbors whispered. She thought about how close she'd come to disappearing into poverty and shame, just another forgotten casualty of a system that valued convenience over people. But Robert had prepared for that possibility. He'd left her the tools to fight back. And somewhere in his final decisions, in his choice to spend his life protecting others, he'd given her the example she needed to do the same. The ceremony ended. The crowd dispersed. Margaret and Grace walked back through the rows of white headstones, each one representing a story, a sacrifice, a family that deserved better than bureaucratic indifference. Tomorrow, Margaret would return to her office and help those families. But today, she simply held her daughter's hand and remembered the man who'd taught them both what courage really meant. They say that on certain November mornings, visitors to Arlington report seeing a woman in a Navy uniform standing by the Eldridge Memorial. Though no one is ever there when they look directly at the stone, just the faint scent of salt water and distant sound of brass buttons gleaming in the light. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more forgotten moments of courage that deserve to be remembered. History isn't just what we celebrate. It's what we choose to uncover when powerful people would rather we forget.